Okay, so let's try again. I sincerely apologize. We lost a connection there earlier on, but what I'm hoping to do, regardless, is that we are able to get through at least some of the material. I realize that we have lost already quite a bit of the uh, time that we have allocated for together. So what I would ask you to do, if you could for me, just to take the, so that we can take the attendance, if you could kindly just post your name on the chat. And that's just a precaution in case we lose each other again. As I said, also, I do realize that there's going to be a little bit of a challenge since we have covered, or we have quite a bit to cover for today, and we have lost already some of the time together. So if you do have to log out and leave at 7:15 when we're scheduled to be done, I completely understand that, and I completely appreciate that. So do not feel sorry if you have to go. I will try to continue until we've gone through the material, regardless. And there will be a recording available of everything that we have covered today. And I'm just here waiting that we would have chance to get the screen sharing working, which doesn't seem very optimistic at the moment. So I'm going to try to work around with the workaround option on that. But at any stage, if you can, if you have questions, just I would prefer if you can unmute yourself. That's probably going to be the quickest and easiest way, since I'm unable to see the chat due to the IT issues. So what I was hoping to do today was to talk about the chapter 2. And really what we're doing on the chapter 2, we're reviewing some of the basic chemistry as it relates to the biology. So last chapter looked all about what biology is and how it's the study of life. And in this chapter, we're starting the study of life on the smallest scale, so on a chemical scale. So I get sometimes students asking, why do I have to know about chemistry? I thought that this was a biology class. But really, the answer goes to the fact that everything in life is made of chemical substances. And if you just bear with me, I'm going to try once more to get the slides to stay where they're supposed to be. Let's try if we have better luck with this. So really everything that you will be studying in biology, whether it is any specialty that you end up going to, will include some level of understanding of the basic chemistry that's behind life. And there are certain elements that we will be looking at that are especially important. And these are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. In fact, these four elements make the 96% of everything of that human is made of. So especially the carbon and hydrogen are going to be very important for us. And really the carbon is the foundation of all organic chemistry. The other concept that I wanted to talk at this point is the concept of matter. And matter is a term that we use to describe in science anything that has a mass. So mass is the scientific term that tells about the weight. Weight is related to the gravity that you're at, but mass really is constant regardless of the gravity that we're under. And all matter also takes up space, so it has a volume. So anything that you see, anything you can imagine that has a mass of some kind and takes space in the universe is considered as matter. Well, you might wonder, why is this important? Why do I care that some things matter? Well, this leads us to the concept of elements. So elements are substances that cannot be broken down further into other chemical substances by normal means that we have available. So they're really the fundamental materials that all matter is made of. And we really don't go into much smaller in the study of elements. We can look at subatomic particles, but elements are probably the smallest scale that we look at when we're looking at how different things act when they act together on this course. And this really brings us to the periodic table of elements, which is something that you might have heard in your previous studies, I hope. And I think that a lot of the content on this chapter really is going to be revision of things that you've heard before. There are currently, based on our understanding, 92 naturally occurring elements and 26 that can be synthesized in a lab but don't remain in a stable form. So that requires a little bit more extra there to be able to produce them and keep them around. But all of these are listed in a periodic table of elements. And we will look at the periodic table of elements a little more later on. But at this point, what I'd hope that you will notice is that all of the letters that we have in a periodic table of element symbolize each one single element. And most of the time, these come from either English or Latin names of these elements. Well, let's consider a little bit the smallest component of the elements, and that would be our atom. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the atoms at this point. So really, if you need to define or want to define the atom, atoms are the smallest units of matter as ordinarily available, and they form the chemical elements that we've been just looking at. And what would be quite important at this point would be to look at the structure of the atom. So there's quite a few things going on there, but we're going to go through them one by one. So what you'll notice is that at the center of the atom, there's a nucleus. And the term nucleus on this context doesn't refer to the cell organelle where the DNA would be stored. We'll talk about cells later on this course. But on this context, the nucleus simply refers to the very center of the atom. And very center of the atom is made of two kinds of substances, of protons and neutrons. So protons and neutrons form the nucleus of an atom. Around them, we end up finding electrons that circulate around the atom on an orbit. And this orbit is constantly moving and constantly changing. So these diagrams that we will use on these chapter, and often you will see in chemistry textbooks, biology textbooks, they are oversimplifications. You can consider them as a snapshot in one time of something that's going on. So really, atoms are not as stationary as these would suggest. So now that we have seen that there's 3 subatomic components that we should talk about, the electrons, the protons, and neutrons, we're going to go a little further. And let's start with the electrons. So these subatomic particles that were circulating around the nucleus, they have a negative charge. And this is going to be very important later on this class as we look at the behavior of different elements. Within the nucleus, we find protons, which instead of negative, actually have a positive charge. And in an ideal situation, if we have an electrically neutral atom, what we end up finding that you would have the same amount of negative charges as positive charges. In that case, the overall charge of that atom would be neutral. The other thing that we end up finding within the nucleus are neutrons, and they do not carry any charge. So that's worthwhile to note. And that will be something that we'll come back to later on, and that makes an important point for us. In terms of the electrons, electrons really have a rather small mass, whereas it's the protons and neutrons that have a larger mass. So this is important because when we are calculating atoms' mass, we only end up including the protons and neutrons. We don't worry about the electrons because their mass is so small. And you will find a mass number which tells the atom's mass in most periodic tables. When you look at the box where the atomic symbol telling which atom we're looking at is present, and usually at the bottom there you will also see the atomic mass. And this was, like I said, calculated from the protons and neutrons. Another thing that you will see on the periodic table of elements, usually at the top of each symbol, is the atomic number of the element that we're looking. And this is derived from the number of protons that the element that we're looking at has. But I really do prefer that we look at these things from the periodic table of elements. So I believe that on your Blackboard course shell for this week, I do believe that I have offered a copy of the periodic table of elements if you don't have that already available. There are many good sources for finding those. And if it's not already there, I will definitely re-upload it there. What I wanted to talk about with you next, it relates to the fact that although the atomic number might be the same, there is a chance that the mass of the atom ends up varying. So you remember the atomic number was derived from the protons, whereas the mass was taking the protons and neutrons together. And we end up finding that for the same element, the mass can vary. If you have varying masses for same element, you end up with talking about isotopes. So it is really the same element or same atom that has different isotopes. So it is the same element, but different forms of it, if you wish. And these are important because they give us a lot of options for doing good, such as if we talk about radioisotopes and radioactivity. One of the things that we always talk in face-to-face classes is that, is radioactivity good or bad? Well, we use radioactivity largely in medicine, for example, as tracers of various things in the body. So, for example, in medical imaging, here we're following where does the blood go in the brain, what are the areas that are using most of the blood, where the blood flow is the highest during different kinds of activities. So that allows us to really see that what's going on in the brain and what areas of the brain are associated with particular activities. The other use where we do end up using radioisotopes, I believe I shared with you at the very beginning of our time together that one of the gigs that I have had on the side or my earlier careers was to work with historical objects and archaeological objects. We can actually use the radioactivity in carbon dating the organic material that where is it, how old it is. That allows us to come up with a pretty good understanding of that. So radioisotopes have definitely positive uses, but they have been used also for bad things. And there's been on purposeful use of radioactivity for weapon industry, and there has been also radioactivity accidents and disasters that have taken place. For example, area around Chernobyl still today is uninhabitable after an accident that took place many tens of years ago. So going back to our periodic table of elements, which we kind of described as a way of seeing all possible elements that we know. And really, I would prefer if you considered all of the elements that we see by considering the periodic table of elements rather than a list of them. Because what we end up finding is that the periodic table of elements is actually a rather useful tool of us. The order in which material is listed there becomes very important when we try to predict how these different elements behave in chemical reactions. So let's have a look of that a little bit. And a couple of terms that we do want to be familiar with relate to the first of all, the groups. So one single line, if you wish, or a row, if you wish, in a periodic table of elements is known as a group. And one single column, if you wish, is known as a period. And what we end up finding is that the elements that are within the same period have largely similar chemical behavior. So that will become very important when we're trying to predict how different elements, when put together to form molecules, end up behaving. And that brings us to the term of molecule. So molecule simply refers to a substance that we have generated by combining two or more atoms. And these two or more atoms are now held together, so they are forming one comprehensive unit or one concrete unit, and they are held together by something known as chemical bonds. And what we will be doing on this chapter for the large part, we will look at three different ways how these chemical bonds can form. And what we end up finding most of the time, most molecules are electrically neutral. So there is no electrical charge that would be positive or negative overall. It ends up positives and negatives balancing each other out. So let's have a look of this a little bit more. So we remember that atoms were these smallest units of matter that we had. We discussed about the protons and neutrons that formed the nucleus, and protons being positively charged. And then we discussed about electrons that circled around the nucleus. And we noticed that the electrons were negatively charged. Well, in this case, what we're seeing, for example, that we have an electrically neutral atom. We have the same amount of electrons, which were negatively charged, as we have protons, which were positively charged. So overall charge of this atom would be neutral. Let's have a look of a little more complex atom. And I have not drawn the nucleus of the atom on this one. So what you're seeing on a very faded color is not an accurate representation of what would be the nucleus of this particular atom. What I want to focus with you is simply the electrons around the atom's nucleus. And what we end up noticing is that these atoms have electrons on their going around their nucleus in predictable manner in terms of how many of them are located on each shell that rotates around the nucleus. So we're going to start from the very middle and look at the first electron shell that's right around the nucleus. And the maximum number of electrons that we can fit in there is 2. So the maximum number of electrons on the first electron shell of any atom is always 2. You cannot fit more than 2 electrons on the first shell. Well, if we end up having a third electron, that third electron simply starts a second electron shell around the nucleus. And we can fit in more and more and more electrons on this second shell until we have in total 8 electrons present in there. And we cannot fit in more than 8 electrons on the second electron shell. Well, if we are left with the 9th electron, then that starts the third electron shell, and we move onwards like that. So there's a maximum number of atoms that each electron shell can hold. What's going to be an important term that we're going to be looking at when we talk about the electron shells is valence shell. And valence shell refers to the outermost shell that we have. Because what happens most of the time when we're studying different elements is that we really don't need to worry about what's going on here on the inner shells, because these electrons are not actively involved in reactions. The electrons that are actively involved in reactions are the electrons that are on the outermost shell. So we're really focused on what is present on the outermost shell, known as valence shell. Well, if we have an electron shell that's full as its outermost shell, we talk about that atom being stable. These atoms or these elements are not very reactive, so they are not keen to take part on chemical reactions forming molecules. Instead, they are quite happy where they're at. They have a full valence shell, so they have no reason to really get involved in any chemical reactions. We do have some atoms that are very close of getting a full valence shell. These atoms that are very close of getting a full valence shell, either by gaining one, which would be on this example probably the easiest strategy to get a full valence shell, or if we would have less electrons on the valence shell and just getting rid of one or few of them, that would be another example of a reactive atom. So if it's easy to get to a full valence shell either by gaining or losing one or few, these atoms are typically very reactive. So they're very eager to take part on various chemical reactions forming different kinds of molecules. So in this case, I have an example of an atom that would be keen to get rid of this one electron. So it could achieve full valence shell because the second electron shell of this atom would then be full. Well, why does this matter? How does this relate to everything that we've talked about, and especially to the periodic table of elements? Well, I mentioned that the periodic table of elements is organized in a particular manner for a very good reason. Well, it shows us that which of these elements have a full valence shell, so which of these elements are very stable, so they're not likely to want to perform chemical reactions. And we find them here as the most right column, if you wish. We do have those elements that are very reactive and very eager to take part on chemical reactions because they are either just short or they are short of an electron or a few, or they just need to get rid of an electron or a few so that they get a full valence shell. These are listed also in the periodic table of elements as columns of their own. So simply by looking at the periodic table of elements, you can predict a particular element's behavior, how eager it is to take part in chemical reactions. Well, that takes us to talk about various chemical reactions that could happen. And you might remember, as a rule of thumb, kind of relating to what we've already noticed, you do want to get a full valence cell. And one way to accomplish the full valence shell in this example picture that I have was to get rid of this one electron. And once this atom does that, then the second electron shell becomes the outermost, so valence shell. And now we have a full valence shell. This atom would be now all of a sudden moving from being very reactive to being very much of a non-reactive. Another example that I have here is relating to an atom that would prefer to gain one rather than getting rid of its electrons. So again, that it would have a full electron shell, and that's what we're seeing happening here. So it would go from being very reactive to being non-reactive once it has a full valence shell, full outermost shell. So as a result of these attempts or these goals of the atoms to reach the state of full valence shell, we end up finding various different kinds of chemical bonds taking place between different elements that we have. And this is really the foundation why we need to know about these chemical bonds, because it is true having these different kinds of chemical bonds that various different molecules are formed. So in a chemical reaction, we rearrange the structure of the atoms that form the molecule. So there's actually a chemical rearrangement so that we end up with a new product. And the original substances that we have that go into this reaction are known as reactants. And the outcome of this reaction is known as product. So often you will see either just us using chemical symbols, or you might have diagrams where there are the reactants, which goes into the reaction, and then an arrow, and on the other side, right side typically, we have the products, which is the outcome, the new substances, typically molecules in the simpler cases, that are produced as a result of this chemical reaction. So what I've done here, I've given you both. I've given you the chemical formula, and I've actually also drawn out each of the atoms, each of the elements that we have taken part on this chemical reaction. So the reactants, what goes into this reaction, are 2 hydrogen ions and 1 oxygen. So whenever we have 2 of something and we write shorthand in chemistry, we just put 2 and then the symbol for that material. So we have 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. We don't end up putting the 1 in front of the O because the basic rules of mathematics, we don't need to have it there. Well, what happens when we combine 2 hydrogens with an oxygen? We are left with H2O. And on this one, the lowercase 2 tells us that now we are talking about molecule rather than individual atoms or individual elements. Now we're talking about something that has connected these parts to each other. It has formed a whole new kind of a product. And what we're seeing is H2O, which of course is our water, as we know. So you can see there just how simply we can show chemical reactions by listing the reactants and the products. Another way to think about that is really, if you try to relate it to your life, let's say that the reactants is taking the academic institution where you go, and taking the effort of study that you put in. As a result of this reaction, you probably end up with great grade and graduating the college. So that would be an example of the reactants and the products. I have a different kind of reaction here that I'm showing. In this one, we have hydrogen peroxide, which contains 2 hydrogens and 2 oxygens in total, arranged in a manner that I've shown here. When we leave hydrogen peroxide on its own over time, it breaks apart into water and oxygen. So we are left with 2 water molecules and 1 oxygen molecule. And this is something that happens just over time. We don't need to do anything for that to happen. So the direction of the reaction is clearly from the left to right. And what happens is that we cannot go back from combining water and oxygen to make hydrogen peroxide. So this is only a one-way reaction that we're seeing here. And these one-way reactions, when we talk about them, they are what we know as irreversible reactions. They can only proceed in one way and one way only. But let's have a look of an opposite situation where actually we don't have a irreversible, we actually have a reversible reaction. In reversible reactions, these reactions can go either way. We can go back and forth. So here we have a bicarbonate and a hydrogen atom. They can combine to form carbonic acid, but also carbonic acid can break down to bicarbonate and hydrogen atom. So this can go either way at any time. So this would be a good example of our reversible reaction. And I'm not expecting you to memorize any of the substances that we're talking, any of the molecules. I'm simply wanting to show you the concept, but show it by using real terms, real substances, and not just making them up. So we saw earlier on, we had this reaction in a way where the reactants were the bicarbonate and hydrogen, and it produced carbonic acid. It could be the other way around. It could be now that our carbonic acid is the reactant, and the product would be bicarbonate and 1 hydrogen ion. So it can be flipped around. There's not a set direction. What's quite nice, if we take this, what we were just looking earlier on, we end up finding that bicarbonate and hydrogen could be combined into bicarbonic acid, which could be separated into carbon dioxide and water. So now we have 3-stepped chemical reaction. So carbon dioxide and water doesn't turn directly to bicarbonate and hydrogen, but if we add the middle step of carbonic acid, we can actually go from one end of the reaction to another. So I hope that that still makes sense and is in line with what you were expecting to see. And this brings us to what I've been alluding throughout our discussion so far of various different kinds of bonds. And these bonds are important because when we had elements joining together, they needed to connect to each other in certain ways. And this is looking at these different ways how the elements can end up connecting to each other. And we're going to start with something known as covalent bonds. And one way I describe the covalent bonds to the students of mine, I say that we have in these covalent bonds atoms that all want to get more electrons. But none of them have quite enough electrons on their own. But if they team up together, they can achieve a stage where everyone has all the electrons that they want, if they are doing sharing. So the good old saying that sharing is caring is definitely applying in here, that if you share your electrons as atoms, you can achieve a stage where everyone has everything that they need. So we are ending up with a bunch of atoms that all have a full valence shell. So let's have a look of that, these covalent bonds. So the way to define them would be that we're sharing electrons between different atoms. And as we are sharing them, those atoms are forming a bond between each other. So what we have here, we have two hydrogen ions, and hydrogen has one electron on its electron shell. And for hydrogen atom to be happy, if you wish, the only way it can become happy to accomplish the full electron shell would be by getting one more, because it cannot get rid of the only electron that it has. So it would need to gain somehow one more electron. And how our hydrogen is going to approach this challenge is by finding someone who would be either willing to give it an electron to keep, or at least share an electron so that they could be happy. Well, oxygen instead, oxygen atoms, they have naturally 6 electrons on their outermost shell. So on their valence shell, they have 6 electrons. For oxygen to reach a stage where they would have a full valence shell, they would need 2 more. And again, they either go into search of another atom that would either give the complete electron to them, or at least be willing to share their electron so that they would be reaching the stage where they have the full valence shell. So full outermost electron shell. Well, what we end up finding happening when we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom, they do exactly what we described as covalent bond. They end up sharing their electrons. So here we have hydrogen that's sharing its electron with oxygen, which is sharing one of its electrons with hydrogen. So now hydrogen has 2 electrons available, and oxygen has gained 1 more electron available for it. And oxygen does this actually with 2 hydrogen atoms. So this way it reaches the stage where it has the full valence shell. And the reason why I've drawn these electrons the way I have drawn here is to make a point that when you are drawing chemical formulas, you don't always need to draw all of these electrons. You don't need to draw all of the electron shells or even just the valence shell. What we tend to do is that we simply add a line wherever there is a pair of shared electrons. So you might have seen this kind of a formula describing our water molecule before. I would dare to guess that if you've seen a formula like this describing water molecule before, it's been probably flipped to look more like this. And we'll discuss about why it would be flipped to look more like this a little later. At this point, what you need to remember is that when we have a single line, that symbolizes a pair of electrons that's being shared. So that's how and why covalent bonds form. And let's have a look at a couple of other examples of covalent bonds. Here we have 2 oxygen atoms. Each one of them have 6 electrons on their valence shell. So now hydrogens are not around in the surrounding area. So what these oxygen atoms can do instead is that they share their electrons. But now they're sharing 2 pairs of electrons. So in total, 4 electrons are being shared. Well, now using the logic that we had before, that for every 1 pair of electrons, we draw a line, we are left with 2 lines symbolizing these shared electrons between these 2 oxygen atoms. So 2 lines telling that we have 2 pairs of electrons being shared. I hope that that makes sense. That is going to be important when we are starting to read the chemical formulas of various molecules. What happens most of the time, or what happens at some times, is that these electrons are shared equally. In that case, if they are shared equally, we talk about this bond being non-polar. So both of these atoms that are involved in this sharing of the electrons get an equal amount of time to hold these shared electrons. So none of these atoms is perfectly happy all of the time, but they are happy most of the time. And how they are happy most of the time is that when they get these shared electrons. And in this case, if they are shared equally, so both oxygen atoms get to hold these shared electrons the equal amount of time, they are non-polar. And let's have a look of a situation where these are not shared equally. And water molecule would be an example of that. In water molecule, we are not sharing these atoms equally. So we have other part of the atom getting more time holding these shared electrons than another part. And in this case, we would describe this atom being polar. And this is going to be important later on when we look at especially the hydrogen bonds. But at this point, what I'm asking you to be familiar is the concept of covalent bond. So sharing electrons to accomplish a full valence shell for a molecule, each unit that makes up a molecule. And I know that we are approaching the time when our class was supposed to end. And because we had all the technical issues, which I sincerely apologize for, we are running a little behind. So if at this point you want to log off, you have to go to other places. I completely understand that. Just make sure that you have dropped your name on the chat so you get attendance for this session. If you are able to stay longer, that's great. I'm going to try to wrap this up in about half an hour, which is the time that we were starting late. And I will record this session as well, so you will have the recording available for you. If you're not able to stay, so you can always check the recording afterwards. Well, with it, at this point, I guess I should check that. Are you all comfortable with the covalent bonds and everything that we have discussed so far? Do you have any questions? Is there any confusion about anything? Can I clarify anything? And I'm not hearing anything being said. I'm gonna check the chat, and it seems like I'm not getting questions there. So I'm simply going to continue onwards. But like I said, I really do appreciate you sticking around if you're able to do that, but that is not an expectation. I realize that you might have places to be and things to do. So just use the recording if you need further information. So we're going to jump back to the what I was just sharing with you, and have a bit of a look of 2 other kinds of bonds that we can have. And the second kind of bond that a molecule might form, the different atoms that form a molecule might use, is known as ionic bond. In an ionic bond, these atoms are able to accomplish a full valence shell by either completely getting rid of some electrons or completely gaining some electrons. So in ionic bond, we are no longer sharing these electrons that are used to accomplish the full valence shell. In ionic bond, we are completely getting rid of or gaining electrons. And let's have a look of this a little bit more in detail. I think that that's a rather good description that I've given there. So a lot of the time in my notes, I will simply abbreviate electrons as E's, and they typically end up having a negative charge also included when I'm writing shorthand. So that's the uppercase negative symbol on top of that E. So on ionic bonds, we accomplish the full valence shell by completely giving away or gaining new electron or electrons. And let's have a look of an example of that, what could be happening. Here we have a sodium atom, and sodium atom has 11 electrons. Now, if we know that we have 11 electrons, we can draw a diagram by using the rules that we learned earlier on. And based on those rules, we could only fit in 2 electrons on the innermost shell. On the second shell, we could fit a total of 8 electrons. That leaves us 1 extra electron, which goes to the third shell. So that helps us to have an idea what the sodium atom looks like in terms of its electron shells. And you notice, since it has only 1 electron on its outermost shell, so on the valence shell, the easiest way for sodium to reach a stage where it would have the full valence shell would be by getting rid of this 1 electron. Well, the situation is pretty much opposite for our chlorine atom here. Chlorine atom has 17 electrons, so 2 of them on the innermost. On the second, we would have 8, and on the outermost third layer, we actually have 7 electrons there. And you remember that a full third layer or full third electron shell would be when we have 8 electrons. So the easiest way for chlorine to become happy, if you wish, would be by gaining 1 electron. So when sodium and chlorine come together, this is exactly what they do. Sodium gives away 1 electron, and now as a result, it will have only 10 electrons left. And our chlorine gained 1 electron, and as a result, now it will actually have 18 electrons present. And this is going to be important for us. This change from going from 11 electrons to 10 electrons in the case of our sodium, and the change of going from 17 electrons to 18 electrons in case of our chlorine. The reason why this is important is that we remember we talked about neutral atoms. And in these neutral atoms, we had the same amount of charges, positive and negative charges present. So we had the same amount of our electrons, which were negatively charged, and protons, which were positively charged. Well, obviously, that is not going to be the case here. Now, after this reaction has taken place with our sodium and chlorine, we end up with the sodium having 1 extra positive charge in its as 1 extra proton, 1 proton more than it has electrons. So overall, now our sodium is going to be slightly positively charged. And that positive charge is just the slightest, but it matters. Well, in case of the chlorine, now we have 1 more electron than we had our positive charges that were held by our protons. So the chlorine is going to be overall just ever so slightly negatively charged. Well, why does this matter, you ask me? Why do we care about this? Well, we end up finding that opposites attract each other. So opposites attract. And what I want to say with that is that when we have atoms that have either a positive or they have a negative charge, we give them special name. If the overall charge is slightly positive, we call it cation, and if it's slightly negative, we call it anion. And cations and anions are attracted to each other. So this is just kind of summarizing what I just had on the previous slide with the atoms being drawn there still. So atom that loses electrons becomes overall slightly positively charged. And now we're going to call it a cation. An atom that receives electrons becomes overall slightly negatively charged, and we're going to be talking about anions. So I hope that that concept makes sense. At this point, what I want to leave it to that and just make you think of and remind you that the positives and negatives will attract each other. And this is, for example, how many salts are being formed. So you'll notice that on this model structure that I've drawn there. So there would be positively and negatively charged atoms that then clump together, forming these crystal-like structures. The final kind of a bond that I want to talk with you today is going to be the hydrogen bond. And hydrogen refers to, our hydrogen bonds are all about our water molecules. And the reason why we are doing hydrogen bonds as separately and why we're talking about them as their own group is because water really is so important for life. We saw that life evolved in water. Much of the earth is covered in water, and about 65 to 75% of you was made of water. And this is the reason why we look for water when we go for search of life in other parts of the our solar system or universe. So based on our understanding, it is necessary that there has been water around, or there is a possibility of water being around for life to have existed or potentially being able to exist on another planet. And I believe that this is a question that I'm asking in your homework, that why do we look for signs of water in planets that we are investigating and considering as potential new locations for humans to relocate, or potential places for life to have existed or being able to exist. And all that has to do with waters having so specific properties, water being essential for life, life having evolved in water, most living things being made largely of water. So that's what I'm looking on the homework. And homework this time, it resembles, there's one question that resembles a little bit like what you've been doing on your labs. So you've been writing a little piece of a short sentence or a couple of sentences. Well, let's get back to the hydrogen bonds. I mentioned that water was a special molecule that we're going to be looking, and that's all to do with the hydrogen bonds. And like I said, the electrons are not shared equally in this kind of a polar bond. So water is considered polar molecule because the electrons are not shared equally between the hydrogen and oxygen. What we end up finding is that the electrons spend a little bit longer time overall at the oxygen end and a little bit shorter time at the hydrogen end. So as a result, when we look at the atom's overall charges, the atom is slightly negatively charged at the oxygen end and slightly positively charged at the hydrogen end. And this is simply to do with the electrons spending more time at the oxygen end than they spend at the hydrogen end. So I've drawn this, what we were just looking earlier on, in a bit more accurate proportions. So the oxygen atom is physically larger than the hydrogens, and that allows us to kind of understand why the electrons would be also more likely to spend more time at that end. And I'm going to take this drawing that we had and remove the symbols that I was using for these atoms and simply draw water molecule as this bundle of 3 balls. But what we do want to remember is these charges: slightly negative oxygen and slightly positive hydrogen ends. And why this is important is that when we have a bunch of water molecules together, they end up interacting with each other. Again, opposites attract each other. So the negative ends of the oxygen atoms end up being attracted to positive ends of hydrogen atoms. However, this attraction isn't so strong that there would be a permanent strong bond. Rather, the bond that results in this is going to be a rather weak bond. But it is a bond between these water molecules nonetheless. So like I mentioned, hydrogen bonds are very weak, and by that I mean that it's easy to break them. But because of this polar nature of the water molecule, they are possible because there's this slight difference in the electrical charge at different parts of the water molecules. And that's what I wanted to say about the hydrogen bonds. So we have covered quite a bit on this at this point. On this chapter, I also have a couple of other things that I'm going to introduce to you. And like I said, I realize if you have to go, this recording will be made available. So I will go through still a couple of other basic chemistry concepts that are important as we continue our study of biology. So a lot of this should be revision of what's to come. It should be things that you might have heard before. So we're going to look at the properties of water. Why water is so special? What makes water so special then? I have told you multiple times now that water is important for life. It's essential for life. Life probably evolved in water. Most living things are made of water. That's what we're looking as evidence of life that has existed or has potential to exist. So there's something very special about water. And I have listed a bunch of characteristics that makes the water so special. So let's start by considering that water is a great solvent. So because water molecule was polar, it works extremely well in dissolving many substances. In fact, water is often described as being a universal solvent. So in this example, just simply I have M&Ms that are dissolving the coloring from the outermost coat to the water. But water really dissolves a lot of things. So it's an excellent solvent. We're able to make a lot of things dissolve into water. So that's the first thing that I wanted to share with you. Second characteristic of properties of water that I wanted to discuss about is the fact that water has high cohesion. So water molecules tend to stick together to each one really well. And this is because of the hydrogen bonding that we just talked about. So because of that, you are able to actually overfill a glass. It just forms this little kind of elevation over the rim. So we're able to fit in a lot more water than should fit in there because these water molecules here are sticking to each other so tightly, they're not giving up and letting part of the water to run off. And the other or third property of water that I want to mention is adhesion. So not only water molecules stick to other water molecules also stick to other polar surfaces. So water is extremely good at sticking to anything that has polar properties in terms of its chemical structure. This can be used for many purposes. One of the purposes is the capillary action. So what we end up seeing is that if we have very thin tube that we're seeing here, water actually ends up climbing within this tube a little bit higher than where the water level would otherwise be. And this is because of this adhesion. These water molecules that we see here, they're sticking to this tube and this thin tube's wall, so it's climbing a little bit higher. And the combination of adhesion and cohesion is what allows our plants to transport water within their vasculature. The next characteristic that's an important property of water is that water has a high surface tension. So we've seen, for example, many of us bugs that seem to walk, and I'm saying this in quotation marks, bugs that seem to be able to walk on the surface of water. This is because these water molecules are clinging together very tightly, especially at the surface of the water, as we saw when we talked about cohesion. So that's having this high surface tension is an important property of water that becomes useful there. Another thing that I wanted to say is that water serves as an excellent heat reservoir. So water can absorb and it also can release heat. And this happens very efficiently. So it's a great way to store energy, especially in terms, say, in the shape of a heat, because we are able to absorb and release that, but also these changes are very slow. So this is why the climate on coastal areas the climate of coastal areas is more consistent. There's lesser of big changes between night and day, because during the day, the seas or the large lakes, the water by the coast ends up storing that extra heat, eliminating the heat rising too much on that area. And then when night comes, the water releases. If it gets colder, if the air gets colder, it releases this heat to the air. And again, the drop in temperature because of this won't be as drastic. So this is why coastal environments, coastal areas have so much more consistent temperatures throughout the single day and night than areas such as Arizona, where we happen to be located at. We notice that in Arizona, you get super hot days and you can get really cold nights. And this is because we don't have great amount of water, great amount of humidity, great amount of moisture to tie that heat and release that heat when needed. So we use this property of water being able to act as a good heat reservoir in many ways. For example, in our body, the blood is used to transport heat either away from your core organs so they don't get too overheated, or as a way to transport heat to these core organs, vital organs, so they remain protected, even if it would mean that we would have to sacrifice other parts of the body, such as getting a frostbite to the nose tip or fingertips or so on. Another thing that I wanted to share with you is that water is able to take, of course, different forms. So we have our solid ice, then we have the liquid water that we're all familiar as well. And of course, we have a gaseous form of water, so water vapor that takes form. I mentioned a little bit about this in relation to heat. So water works as a great transport media. Not only we're able to transport heat, we're able to transport nutrients, we're able to transport waste products, we can transport many gases such as oxygen to the tissues, get rid of carbon dioxide from the tissues, transport that to the lungs. So really, we utilize water as a transport media. The most common transport media in human body is, of course, our blood. Plants as well transport water so that they're able to get the water from the root system, from the soil, and through the root system to the leaves where the photosynthesis happens, and that would require water to be present, nutrients to be available. And it is within this water that the nutrients are transported on the plant to the leaves. So really, water is the foundation of life. Really, we are able to exist because we have water around, and our bodies and life as we know has been able to successfully utilize water for its benefit. Well, there are a couple of more concepts that I do want to share with you. I want to share the concept of hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So this is going to be important again as we are talking about water. So if something is hydrophilic, what we're meaning by that is that it's attracted to it. And it's attracted in this case to water. So if something is hydrophilic, it always searches to find water and be next to the water, form bonds with the water. Hydrophobic substances instead do what you would do if you have a phobia of something. So if you have a phobia of spiders, you're probably going to try to avoid those spiders. So hydrophobic substances stay away from water. And this is thanks to the polar nature of the water, that substances can be either hydrophilic or hydrophobic. And the reason why I want to bring this up at this point is that later on this course, we will talk about cells. And we will talk about cell membranes in particular. And what you're seeing here is a picture of a cell membrane. A part of the cell membrane, you can see there's a big protein embedded on it. But cell membranes are made of two layers of phospholipids. And phospholipids have both hydrophilic and hydrophobic end. The hydrophobic ends try to stay away from water. So what they end up doing is that they pack against each other. Hydrophilic ends are attracted to water, so cell walls are facing towards water. So that's a concept that we'll come and revisit later on. At this point, I just wanted you to know the terms hydrophilic, so attracted to water, and hydrophobic, avoiding water. And that brings us to consider that why does ice float? And at one point, I was asking in homework questions such as, oh, you have a garden hose in the garden where you've been watering using that hose, and then comes the cold night, you forgot to turn off the water, well, or empty the hose, and in the morning when you come, there's no, the hose has been damaged because the water expanded as it froze. The same concept relates to why does ice float. So let's have a look of that. So when we have water taking different forms, the water has different properties in different forms. In a liquid water, the molecules are packed very close to each other. If you look at this sketch that I have there, these water molecules were packed what seemed a little bit randomly, but very tightly next to each other. In a solid form instead, water ends up freezing, and when water freezes, it forms this kind of crystal-like structure where the water molecules are as far away from each other as they possibly can to every direction. So now the molecules are further apart, and we end up having the same amount of water taking more space because these water molecules are spreading as far away from each other as they possibly can. And this is really the reason why you should not put glass bottle in a freezer. The consequences if you've done that are pretty bad. You should not let the pipes burst during a freeze. There can be many things that happen if you don't know the basics of science. So I say that world seems like a magical place when you don't know science. Now you know why this happens. It's no longer just about bad luck. It's because of the properties of water that it ends up taking more space, greater volume when it freezes. So when the water is packed as molecules that are packed closer to each other, the weight of the mass of this substance is greater. So it's much more dense than liquid water. Whereas ice, where the water molecules are further apart from each other, we have more space there, so it's lighter in comparison to the same volume. Well, because we know that the ice is a little lighter for the same volume, because in this one, water molecules are further apart from each other, it ends up that the ice floats on water. So that's why icebergs floated. And I think that this is really the last concept that I really want to highlight here on this chapter. And I believe you should have heard about pH scale before. If you have not, it's a scale that runs all the way to the pH 14, the neutral pH being pH 7, and anything that's higher than 7 is considered as basic, and anything that's below 7 is considered as acidic. So often you might end up wondering, well, where does this number come from? Why do we have different numbers? Well, this number is actually a reflection of a scale. And on this scale, we're looking at the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. So you remember I mentioned hydrogens being one of the very, very common elements that we end up finding in life and in us, around us, in living things. So what we do to formulate a pH scale, we simply organize substances based on the concentration of hydrogen ions in them. So pH 7, neutral. Anything with smaller than 7 as their pH is considered as acidic, and anything with higher than pH 7 is considered as basic. We do have certain chemicals that help us to keep the pH within the normal range in the body. Let's say, for example, blood pH. Blood pH is typically 7.35 and between 7.35 and 7.45. So there is only a difference of 0.1 in the pH of the blood, how it varies. So how are we able to keep the pH of the blood so consistent? Well, that's thanks to buffers that we utilize in our body. So these chemicals help us to keep the pH within the desired range. And we'll be talking much more about buffers later on this course, and we'll be doing a lab where we look at which things are good buffers, which ones are not. So at this point, as long as you are comfortable with the term buffer being a chemical that helps to keep matters, for example, the pH within the normal range, you're all set, you're all good. What happens if you get too acidic? As a human body that gets too acidic, in this case, there's a lot of hydrogen present, and this will have certain consequences for our well-being, and that would, in an extreme case, if we deviate too far, we end up having issues with your breathing being depressed, your lungs not working properly, and it can be lethal in the worst case scenario. If some of the signs and symptoms that I wanted to share. You get sleepy, a little bit confused, might lose consciousness, headache. In a worst case, like I said, even coma can result. Muscles feel weak, coughing, shortness of breath, arrhythmia, increased heart rate, and so on. Couple of words just to kind of wrap up. From everything that we have talked now, we've seen that there are certain elements that are more common than others, and certain elements that we end up finding a lot when we are doing the chemistry of life. Well, carbon and hydrogen are going to be especially important. So we often say that carbon and hydrogen are the basis of all organic chemistry. And by organic chemistry, we talk about things that are or have been living at some point. So all living things, or if things have been living and are no longer, they are likely to have carbon and hydrogen present in their chemical structure. And it is because the carbon's properties of having 4 electrons on its valence shell that carbon is very reactive. Carbon tends to try to make molecules with other substances. So that's why most organic molecules, we end up finding carbons forming what we describe as a backbone of these molecules. As a funny side note, I just go and look at products and look at misleading advertising. There was recently salt and salt bottle where they told that it's not a GMO. Well, salt is not a living, it's never been a living thing, so it can't be GMO. All salt is non-GMO because there is nothing to edit there. There's not been nucleus, there's not been DNA at any point. So knowing the terminology allows you to also pick up when there's a little bit of a slice happening. In terms of organic chemistry, I mentioned that carbon and hydrogen forms the backbone of many substances. What we see sometimes is that we have a chemical formula where we have same amount of carbon, but the shape of the molecule can vary a lot. So these are all molecules with the same chemical formula, but very different form that they end up taking. So these are known as isomers. Isomers of the same substance has the same number of materials, same number of atoms in it, but they can be organized in many different ways. And the way they are organized affects the behavior of these molecules. Final thing that I'm sharing with you on this review or on this chapter is that most organic materials where we have this hydrocarbon backbone have then various functional groups. Functional groups you can consider as things that we add into that carbon backbone of a molecule. And I've given a list of a couple of different kinds of functional groups for you, and I believe that this as well is available on your Blackboard, and if it's not, I will definitely upload it there. So certain functional groups cause typically certain kind of chemical reactions to take place. So we wanna, if we are doing chemistry, we want to be able to spot what functional groups are in a molecule because we can predict then the behavior of that molecule. And that really sums up everything I wanted to share about this chapter with you. I know that we went over time, and I said early on this course that I always try to be very respectful of your time. So I really appreciate you having sticked around. If you could do me a favor and post your name once again, and I will make sure that you get extra credit for having stayed around, so that you get recognition for having been on this session. I'm a very big believer on extra credit. So this way I will make sure to recognize that you sticked around. And like I said, this session will be available as a recording. For this week, you will be completing a lab where we're looking at metric system. So we didn't have a chance to discuss about the lab as such, but I believe that the lab is fairly self-explanatory. And if you don't find it as an easy lab to work through, you can always let me know, and I'll be more than happy to organize a session either with you or with the entire class where we can talk through some of those metric system oddities. I really appreciate you having joined me tonight, and I really, really do appreciate that you sticked till the end. I hope this helped with the material for today. And if you have any questions, feel free. You can ask now. I can pause or stop the recording if you don't want to ask them on a recording. Otherwise, I thank you and I wish you very good rest of the evening. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good night. I really appreciate you guys.